tetragrammaton.
I feel, at least, why gatekeep? Why hang on to this old secret society model when this stuff can be really useful for people? And luckily that's worked. And what I've discovered is that people from all over the world, from all different walks of life, backgrounds, persuasions, religious backgrounds, are all interested. And that's been really exciting, because I came from like the model of like, this was for people who listen to Coil. You know what I mean? And now it's like, no, actually everyone is interested.
How did you first get interested?
I have a very distinct memory of when I think I must have been 5 or 6, a thought came to me that it was important to bring magic back to the world for whatever reason. I have no idea where that thought came from or why I had that thought, but that has, for whatever reason, despite my best efforts at times, been my singular focus for my entire life.
Tell me about the house you grew up in.
Well, I moved around a lot, but I grew up in San Diego in the 80s in Mission Hills, which is right next to Hillcrest, which is the gay community, which at that time meant that I grew up seeing guys dying of AIDS. But the house that I grew up in, it was on a canyon, and I spent most of my time digging in the backyard. It had been a dance hall in the 20s where there had been a fire, and all of the stuff from the fire had been just thrown out into the canyon in the aftermath. And so I spent my childhood digging up like these kind of old trinkets and things from a 20s dance hall, but trying to uncover mysteries. And so that's kind of been my life since too.
And what was the nature of your relationship with your parents?
Very good. My dad's a journalist. My mom is a nurse practitioner, retired.
Still alive, still together?
Yes, thankfully.
Nice, beautiful.
Yeah. So very good. My interests have been confusing for them, but I think that as time goes on, hopefully they've seen that it's a real thing. But magic has always been part of my life, and I think it's those early childhood experiences that anyone who's interested in this subject is probably has, but there is a formal study, and I spent, from my late teens onwards into my 20s until now, formally pursuing it and going all over the world and trying to absorb everything that I could so that eventually I could kind of process it through my system and create what I've created. So it's like, here's the good stuff. Because there's lots of stuff with magic that is, frivolous. So,
yeah.
I think that the process of going through magic, there's so many stages of it. And it's like every single time in my life, I thought that magic was something different.
Mm-hmm.
And the better seems to be as I relax, control, and just let it be what it is instead of trying to shape or own or control or anything like that. But I had an experience walking through a field where there was a perfect circle of flowers, like yellow flowers that had grown. And it looked like a fairy circle. And I realized no one's ever going to see this except me. It just emerged. Somebody didn't create it. And I think that Tibetans share this view. It's like a spontaneously emerging property of nature. And I feel that it's basically the same as the creative process. I think in reading your book, it's like it's the same thing,
it's
right?
The same thing.
When I'm talking to rationalistic people about magic, we can talk about the scientific thing, but the scientific thing is a hard sell because it's not scientific at all. It's a kind of a relic of the science's past, but it is perfectly relevant to art and the creative process. In a way, magic is, I think, a fellow traveler with art. It works with the same material. It takes a slightly more kind of engineering, techie approach to like trying to understand and categorize that. And there's, of course, good things and bad things about that because it can become overly formalized and then people just become hidebound by academic stuff.
Can you walk me through each of the modalities you learned in the order that you learned them? We can be here. We have forever.
Okay, great.
So start from the beginning. What was the first technique?
What was the first thing? The first thing I did, and this is what I recommend to anyone who gets into this, the one thing that I tell people who are interested in magic is the last thing you ever want to do is read occult books, don't do that. Like, that's because you're going to get you can do that later, but you're going to get caught up in thinking that there's a way you have to do things. So when I first got into this, I first, I read a guy named Colin Wilson who wrote a great book in the 60s where he said that the occult might be the key to humanity's future evolution. And to me, that was like, whoa, that's super exciting. And it was in the culture. So when I first became interested in magic, what I did is I sat down and I just wrote down a list. It's like, okay, I don't know if magic's real or if it's a delusion or a scam, but if there actually was magic, what would it be? And then I just sat down and wrote down everything that I thought it would be. And it was like stuff from like the Third Doors album, like media theory, like and it was just like a total jumble of things. But then I was like, well, if magic was real, what would you be able to do with it? And then I went and tried to do all of those things just on a totally intuitive basis. And a bunch of them worked. And in a way, I've been trying to get back to that ever since, because then I decided, okay, well, now I have to learn the real way. Like, every culture has their own magical system. And, California is generating 18 new ones a day. So there's a lot to learn.
On your esoteric path, what was the first learning?
Okay, so actually, let me think. What did I start doing? I was really into William Burroughs. I started trying to contact William Burroughs. I built an ancestral altar and started trying to talk to my ancestors, and I put William Burroughs on it. And that's probably what did this. That's probably his fault. But no, I started to learn chaos magic because it was only when I discovered chaos magic that I actually started to say, okay, like, this is goofy, but I think this could actually be a thing. Like,
what is chaos magic?
So chaos magic is not about causing chaos, which is what people usually think, is a form of magic that was started. It's basically the punk rock version of magic. It was created in England in the 70s. And
1970s.
Yeah.
Recently.
Yeah. Late 70s in Leeds.
Rock and roll
like
time.
1970. Yeah, it was like neck and neck with the punk movement in England. It was the same thing. It was like the same thing as throwing out the prog rock of Thelema and Crowley and all this and the kind of thing. Or it's like, we don't need any of this. We can strip magic down to the core, which they said was altered states of consciousness is the core of magic. That's only part of it, in my opinion. But basically what they said is if you abstract magic to a meta level and you just look at what's actually happening in someone's psychology, then all these symbols, like the pentagrams and the gods and goddesses and stuff like that, you can kind of take those and leave those. Those are cultural trappings. And even more excitingly, which not many people have done, but one of the things chaos magic said is once you understand the mechanism of magic, which is more or less you're kind of using altered states to reprogram your unconscious mind. Once you understand the mechanism of it, you can create your own symbol set. You can create your own religion and it'll work just as well. And that idea really appealed to me. The idea of a DIY religion as creating your own personal religion for yourself. That was exciting to me. I guess it's very, every religion in the world would see it as blasphemous, but the idea of seeing religions as kind of a creative thing to work with.
And did you learn about it through reading about it, or?
At first.
And what were the books then? What would have been the books?
The best one that I read early and that I recommend to people who are interested in, are skeptical, is The Occult by Colin Wilson, which I mentioned, which is very 60s. It's kind of like a 60s existential book. But he says that there's this thing that he calls faculty X, which is there's this something that some people seem to have, like a genius, basically. How do Marcel Proust, like, how is he different? Or like, what creates somebody like that? And he said that there's something in the human psyche called faculty X that can create genius, and that the occult potentially could be the way to turn it on. He was Britain's darling of existential literature. And then when his fortunes started to fall, he started writing more popular kind of pulp fiction-y stuff. And so he started investigating the occult. And so he very seriously looked at it and said, actually, what these people are doing, like Crowley, Blavatsky, all these people, yeah, there may be all this kind of like goofy language on top of it, but they may be tapping into part of the human mind that could potentially be the future of human evolution. And I still believe that. Not that we're going to turn into Ninja Turtles, but in the sense that clearly there are capabilities that human beings have that most don't turn on. Why? I don't know. I would love to talk to you about it, Mm-hmm. But I studied that, and then practically there was a book called Libernal and Psychonaut about chaos magic that was great. There was a book called Modern Magic by Donald Michael Craig, which was more on the Hermetic side. But I studied chaos magic, Hermeticism, a little bit of voodoo, which I backed off from, neurolinguistic programming.
Why'd you back off from the voodoo?
Not for me. Not for me. It's too culturally specific. It runs into some dangerous territory, like seriously dangerous and criminal world and things like that. So that I backed off from. And then from then on, it was just kind of like this breakneck pace of how many of these things. I was consuming religions like people do drugs in their 20s, trying to get high in all these different ways and seeing how they were different. And for me, the most important thing is, what state can you get into following those techniques, rather than what's the doctrine and all of that?
How much do drugs play into it? Because if it's about altered states of consciousness, drugs are definitely a shortcut to that.
More than they should. And,
drugs play in more than they should.
In my opinion. Yeah. Substances have been part of magical practice since the dawn of history. Shamans use them and all of that. But I think
plant medicines.
Right. But I think that's been overplayed, and for obvious reasons. And I think that there are a million different types of altered states of consciousness you can get into. The creative act, dancing, singing, chanting, fasting, all these things that are healthy. And I ended up, through a bizarre set of circumstances, training as a shaman in Kathmandu. And when you actually interact with shamans, what you realize is it's not this kind of romantic idea people have. Shamanism throughout most of the world is what people do when they don't have access to healthcare, and drugs are not necessarily part of it. Drumming and chanting can be, but I think people here want to use shamanism as a justification to party, basically, and that's not what it is. So, and of course, if you have magical experiences through drugs, that's great, but you can't tell anyone because they're going to say, were you on drugs? Yeah. Well, maybe that's not quite so believable.
And if you look at Ram Dass, he, started with LSD and then went to India and became Ram Dass to find another way. It's like the drugs were a shortcut that allowed him to see that there was more.
Yeah.
And then his path led him to find it without drugs.
I think so. I think psychedelics can, not always, but have at times been useful for Western people, particularly because we're so materialist and rationalistic. Sometimes it needs like something to break through that's a little bit extra strength.
On that path, other modalities that really struck you as important?
Okay, so yeah, if we want to go through every single modality. Yeah, okay.
Let's do it.
So we talked about chaos magic. Chaos magic is great because it basically says it empowers you to do it the way you want to do it. And it's a good framework for jumping into everything else, because the basic belief of chaos magic is that none of it is true. It's just fun, like all these different religions. So from there...
Is it rooted in anything before the 70s, or it just starts in the 70s?
Oh, it grows directly out of the English occult tradition. I mean, prior to that, it was basically that Crowley was dominant. The ideas of chaos magic begin in Crowley. They go back to Austin Osman Spare, the artist, who was a contemporary of Crowley. And really, there's nothing new about chaos magic. It's just a new way of articulating something that I think not only have humans been doing since the beginning of history, but, everyone has shamanic or occult experiences. They just don't dress up.
Is that true of the Crowley as well, that it's based on all old stuff?
Yeah. But Crowley did a very good job of synthesizing a lot of the old techniques. So chaos magic, then Hermetic magic kind of goes back to, Hermetic magic goes back thousands of years. That is what I tend to consider the actual Western magical tradition, which relates to things like Kabbalah, Tarot, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Enochian, Egyptian magic. That came out of Freemasonry, which is also something I explored. And that is the much more structured academic approach to magic. It comes out of Victorian England. The Golden Dawn at that time was an occult group that pretty much all of the biggest movers and shakers in Victorian society joined, like W.B. Yeats and Bram Stoker.
1700s?
Late 1900s.
Late 1900s?
Yeah, Victorian England.
Oh,
yeah,
I see.
Yeah. And on into the early 20th century. It didn't dissolve till the 1910s.
Mm-hmm.
And that group...
But that also was a revival.
It was. Yeah, it's like the occult. It's a perpetual occult revivals.
Mm-hmm. What's the original? Is Hermes, is that the beginning?
So Hermes was most likely a pen name that a lot of people used. Kind of like If you know situationism, they all use the pen name Luther Blissett for the situationist writings. It was the same way in the first millennium. Hermes, all these works were attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, again, so people wouldn't be killed probably. But Hermeticism goes back to Gnosticism. It goes back to the centuries after Christ. And Hermeticism is this super academic, complex, apparently complex magical system. But I would summarize Hermeticism by saying it's simply taking nature as a language and assuming that the symbols you are seeing are speaking to you.
All rooted in nature.
Well, understanding that we are everything is nature, that we're essentially in the mind of God, and that the mind of God is talking to us through all of this.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Yeah. I mean, once you strip down all like the complex stuff, these are conclusions that human beings have been coming to since the beginning of human history. So Hermeticism tends to be a path of using ceremonial magic to fully exteriorize and articulate yourself as a being, as a spiritual being. It tends to be concerned with power. That power is not what people... Spiritual power is never power in the world. It's all internal states. But that evolved into Thelema, which was Crowley's system, which is where he combined the Hermetic Order, the Golden Dawn, with all the high-octane meditation techniques from India and Thailand. And that's where we started to get to where we are now, I think, where we're in this really exciting moment now where we're bringing together all the best teachings of Western and Eastern spirituality into one thing. So let's see, there's those. Neurolinguistic programming, more modern version, came out of hypnosis, much more about the magical use of language. With Western magic, there's kind of a continuum, because you mentioned chaos magic as a break. There's kind of a continuum of Gnosticism to Hermeticism, Catharism, which was unfortunately wiped out during the Crusades, which was a Gnostic revival in southern France. It goes through the Knights Templar, it goes to the Freemasons. Now, these are not like unbroken secret society lineages like from a cartoon or something like that. These are ideas that come back throughout history, almost like living information.
LMNT, element electrolytes. Have you ever felt dehydrated after an intense workout or a long day in the sun? Do you want to maximize your endurance and feel your best? Add element electrolytes to your daily routine. Perform better and sleep deeper. Improve your cognitive function. Experience an increase in steady energy with fewer headaches and fewer muscle cramps. Element electrolytes. Drink it in the sauna. Refreshing flavors include grapefruit, citrus, watermelon, and chocolate salt. Formulated with the perfect balance of sodium, potassium, and magnesium to keep you hydrated and energized throughout the day. These minerals help conduct the electricity that powers your nervous system so you can perform at your very best. Element electrolytes are sugar-free, keto-friendly, and great tasting. Minerals are the stuff of life. So visit drinklmnt.com/tetra and stay salty with Element Electrolytes. LMNT.
As we move through these, would you say 80% of the old has made it into the next?
Yeah, if you want to break it down like that.
Just
yeah,
so I can
think
picture.
So. I think so.
How strong is the game of telephone?
Pretty good. If you just look at the Western tradition, because you go from there to Freemasonry, and Freemasonry codifies everything. And well, you go through the Renaissance, you go through John Dee and Enochian, and then you get to Freemasonry. And once Freemasonry codifies everything, then that becomes the bedrock from which the Golden Dawn and Thelema grow from. And so they're all pretty similar. But each time the wheel turns, it gets pushed further with more effective techniques, which is basically where I find myself now, trying to re-articulate this for internet people.
Would you say it keeps getting refined or simplified, or no, not always?
Both.
Refined and simplified.
Simplified, not always. Yeah. And sometimes it shouldn't be simplified, I think, because sometimes like the theater of it is really useful. It's like you want to like have the pomp and circumstances of it because it's fun and it like gets you in the vibe. So you have kind of that trajectory of Western magic, which is this kind of Masonic, pagan, hermetic, Kabbalistic. On the Eastern side, it's another continuum. So it's kind of possibly helpful to think of these things as two continuums. On the Eastern side, you have meditation and yoga, which come from India. Everything goes back to the Himalayas. And then that goes into Buddhism, which uses the same techniques, but puts a different metaphysical framework on it, and then evolves the techniques. And those two, Hinduism and Buddhism and the many, many, many sub-schools of them are vast magical systems that, in the case of, like, for instance, Hinduism is practiced by 1 billion people. Buddhism is a lot. So those are much more living traditions than the Western tradition. But those tend to be the two major branches. And I did my best to go through both of them. And I think that the ultimate is combining meditation and magic. One way a modern, maybe California way to look at that would be more like you have meditation and yoga, and then you do manifesting. You focus on your goals you want to achieve. Like that's something you could talk to people about at Whole Foods, and they would know what you were talking about. Those are kind of the two major tributaries. And
where does astrology fit?
Okay. Astrology is a big part of the Western tradition and the Eastern tradition.
Both.
They're huge. In India, they plan everything according to astrology. Like the parents arrange marriages for their kids with astrology. Like they plan like traffic based on astrology or things like that. Yeah, huge part of both. And I'm not a big astrology person, so I don't know a ton about it. I know the planetary signs and I know what the energies are, but I'm not a huge astrology person. I have other people that teach courses on astrology on my site, but it is a big part of it. And this is something that Damien Eccles knows a lot about. He talks a lot about this as kind of magic being a stellar tradition, that it's actually in many ways, and this is true, it really is about, it's about communication with the universe. So of course it's about everything up in the sky as well. I don't know, that sounded kind of vague, but I'm not necessarily even a believer in astrology, so I'm not necessarily the person to talk to about that.
Are you a believer in magic?
No.
Okay. Do you believe in God?
No.
Okay.
But that's a good place to start from, right?
Yeah.
I try to take a very via negativa approach to things, where I just disbelieve stuff and see what stays. But what I mean by that is, I was wigging out. I was like, fuck, Rick Rubin wants me to come talk. What the hell am I going to tell him? Like, what am I going to tell Rick Rubin? What am I, like, I got to come up with a new definition for magic. But I got to thank you because I came up with the best one ever, in my opinion. This is great. So this is my definition of magic now, which I think cuts kind of past all this stuff. Because ultimately all the cultural trappings, the symbols, the history, the revivals, none of that actually matters, because what we're talking about is a process that just happens in the human mind. I suppose it would be like, reading what every other writer had written or listening to what every other artist had written when you're looking back at the history of magic, but that's what they did. So what's important is the process. And so my definition of magic now is, it is the imaginary number in life's equation.
You want to say more about that?
Okay. So before I started getting D's in math in high school, I did learn the concept of imaginary numbers, which is, I think, from trigonometry. So an imaginary number is the square root of -1, which is impossible. You can't square root the negative of 1. However, it turns out that you need the square root of -1 to solve a lot of really critical problems. So mathematicians invented an imaginary number, which is just the lowercase letter I. It's an imaginary number. It stands for the square root of -1 and is necessary to solve all these equations. So in the same...
does it solve the equations, or does it just create a theoretical construct that might be the case?
I would assume the latter, but I'm not sure, actually. I should definitely look that up. But this is basically what magic is. It's like, you're asking me if I believe in magic. It's like, well, I think that magic is imaginary, but the imaginary is pretty important. Everything that exists on this planet has come through the imagination first. Everything. The roads were in somebody's imagination first. And I'm sure every creative person, has the experience when they're young where their teacher's yelling at them, quit daydreaming, pay attention, that's not going to pay the bills when you're an adult. Well, turns out that's not the case. It's like the imagination is critical. So when I talk about magic being an imaginary number, it's like, think of all the things that human beings have imagined throughout history that they've then made real. It's like we take flight for granted now. That was imaginary. Or, I just decided to imagine that I was a magician, and it turns out the world decided to go along with my game.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to work in the publishing industry, and it's unfortunately is on its last legs. There are very rarely successful books in publishing.
What did you do in publishing?
I was a copy editor.
Ooh.
Yeah, well, I was the editor for a publisher called Disinformation, and then one called Feral House. That's how I got my start writing and getting books out, just by working in the industry. It's like, Harry Potter was a success, so everyone tried to do Harry Potter. Well, only Harry Potter is Harry Potter.
How much do you think Harry Potter's success had influence on people being open to magic?
Huge. And it's funny because it's kind of like after my time, so I never read it. So it's like I'm from like this slightly before that, but gigantic. Actually, I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were saying about Harry Potter. They grew up in a violent environment, and they didn't have a childhood. So it was only through reading Harry Potter that they could experience what having a childhood was like. And I was just like, okay, that's such a service to the world, But I think in terms of magic specifically, because kids grew up with the idea that's possible. Is that good? I don't know, because I think we'd need a lot more rationality in this culture too. Things are definitely getting a little sliding sideways at the moment. But
says the magician.
Yeah, no. I'll be the first person to say, like, you don't want lots of guys like me. You want like one who's hopefully funny, and can kind of like keep the guardrails on a little bit. Maybe a few, but like you don't need that many guys like me. You need scientists, you need STEM people, you need Carl Sagan, So I'm happy to be this guy, but yeah, I'm all for critical thinking, logic, and the scientific method. But also, I'm for all of that applied to magic. You mentioned astrology, and although I'm not big into astrology, one of Crowley's students made the point that from alchemy, we got chemistry. From astrology, we got astronomy. Okay, well, what science might we get if we study the pure mechanisms of magic itself, of the mind, and how the mind can be trained to focus on creating experiences or accessing deep states of creative inspiration or spiritual oneness or healing. These things are all not just possible, but easily doable with the right techniques. I mean, as a meditator, right? There are yogic techniques that have been around for thousands of years that are better than drugs. It's not just that people turn to them to get away from drugs, it's that they're better than drugs. So
based on that, do we know that astronomy is superior to astrology? Do we know that chemistry is superior to alchemy?
I suppose it depends on the use case. Yeah. Certainly for interacting with the physical world, yeah, I think so. But we live in a culture that's been through the post-Nietzsche moment and been through the scientific revolution. And I think that I would hope that now we can kind of go back and look at some of these things that we dropped along the wayside. It's like Freud, when he was getting psychiatry out into the world, intentionally left out anything that looked like the occult or mysticism or anything like that, because he wanted it to be accepted. And the early scientists did the same thing. They're like, we are not talking about alchemy, we're not talking about astrology, none of this stuff. And those were probably the right decisions. But maybe we left something behind along the way. And I think at the very least, magic is, you can almost look at it as the science of creativity. It's a set of techniques for tapping into specific states of consciousness in a very, very precise and refined way, almost like computer code, that you can't really do just taking mushrooms or whatever.
Who was John Dee?
John Dee was the original 007. He was the guy that created the British intelligence services, and his number in them was 007. He was Queen Elizabeth I's court advisor, and he's responsible for more aspects of the modern world than I was prepared to realize. Obviously, he's very famous in the occult world because he spent a couple decades actually attempting to contact angels, and apparently succeeding from all cases. There's hundreds of pages of records of his conversations with angels. But he's also responsible for giving us the idea of the British Empire, which he said an angel gave to him. An angel told him there should be a British Empire and Queen Elizabeth I should be a world monarch. He's also responsible for advances in optics that made it possible for Britain to build a navy that led to conquering the planet. What else? He introduced geometry to the public, for the English-speaking public for the first time, by introducing Euclid's Elements in its first published edition. He basically laid the foundation for modern science. He had this center called Mortlake, which is in the suburbs of West London, where it was like this academy for all of England, where all of the scientific leading lights would be there, like Tycho Brahe and all of these people.
And what years was he around?
Mid-1500s. He had the biggest library in England, in the world possibly at that time. He was most likely the smartest person in Europe. And he created this environment where he was able to foster and nurture all of these people who became the scientific revolution. It was still prior to the scientific revolution happening. So it was kind of this moment where, like, this exciting moment where all these intellectually adventurous people were together, early scientists, along with what would be the equivalent of, I don't know, like angel investors now. The startups of those days were naval instead of internet, but it was the same type of thing, where modern science emerged from. But it was still like mixed up with the occult because those two things had not separated yet. So it's like this moment in history.
Was it unusual that he was into the occult, or was that the norm then?
It was unusual for someone of his stature. It was widespread in the culture, but it would kind of be like the equivalent of, I don't know, like an NSA consultant deciding to, start going to Burning Man and spend 10 years doing psychedelics and going off the deep end. It'd be somewhat similar. So it's like those things are very popular, but for somebody his standing, it was considered, basically ended his career. And he was kind of shuffled off to the side, and it was considered that he'd kind of gone off the deep end. But with a psychic named Edward Kelly, he spent 10, 20 years doing practically daily occult rituals to talk to these angels that more or less outlined the plan for what would become the next 500 years at least of Western history in terms of the creation of America, the uniting of the world under what they wanted was a new super religion to unite all the religions, which is slowly kind of happening, I think, on its own without a human being doing it. You see that here in California. There's practically a Californian religion kind of that's emerged that people kind of, like be grateful, energy, that type of thing. It's
the New Age.
The New Age, yeah. But it's kind of spontaneously emerged from people's exploration. So he, for me, is the high water, certainly a high water mark of magic. And it's this fascinating crossroads time in history where there wasn't any difference. It was magic, science, imperialism, Shakespeare, this incredible psychedelic outflowing of culture that was probably akin to the 60s. It's the last time in Western history where magic was still taken seriously by scientific authorities. So in terms of, it's kind of like, as a person in 2024 trying to assess this material for the modern world, it's kind of like, well, the last time it was scientifically studied was like the 1500s. So This is kind of where we have to work back from.
How did you research the book?
I spent 4 years, I rented an office, and I spent 3 years, 40 hours a week reading every single thing that had ever been written in writing. And I went all over to academic records in California and England. So it was a full-time pursuit. And how I was able to do that, I'm still not sure, because somehow I was able to stay afloat financially while I was doing that. Yeah, it was my full-time job for 3 years, and then a full-time job for a year marketing it. But what I wanted to do with that book is do the definitive book on what Western magic actually is. So it says John Dee, but it's from a historical standpoint and not a reconstructionist or wishful standpoint.
So much of today's life happens on the web. Squarespace is your home base for building your dream presence in an online world. Designing a website is easy using one of Squarespace's best-in-class templates. With the built-in style kit, you can change fonts, imagery, margins, and menus, so your design will be perfectly tailored to your needs. Discover unbreakable creativity with Fluid Engine, a highly intuitive drag-and-drop editor. No coding or technical experience is required. Understand your site's performance with in-depth website analytics tools. Squarespace has everything you need to succeed online. Create a blog, monetize a newsletter, make a marketing portfolio, launch an online store. The Squarespace app helps you run your business from anywhere. Track inventory and connect with customers while you're on the go. Whether you're just starting out or already managing a successful brand, Squarespace makes it easy to create and customize a beautiful website. Visit squarespace.com/Tetra and get started today.
At what point in your study did you decide this is something I want to share as opposed to just practice?
It's kind of funny. I had real beginner's luck in my career where just like everything seemed, it's like I felt like every door opened for me as soon as, and then that went away later. But like at the beginning, I was a junior in college and I went to work for a company called Disinformation, which was a somewhat conspiracy publisher at that time, but they put out a bunch of occult material, like one called the Book of Lies and things like that. So it was in Chelsea in New York, and it was just it was like extremely, at that point, it had a ton of buzz behind it, publisher that was doing occult and conspiracy stuff. I went and basically just asked for an internship. They gave me, because I was writing for them. So I had an internship, and then the publisher of the company immediately said, asked me if you ever want to pitch a book. So I thought about that, and then, so what I came back with was, my first book was called Generation Hex, and I decided to pitch magick as a new youth culture. Like this was going to be the next big youth culture, right? Essentially as a magical act. It turned out I was right, just way a little ahead of time, because now there's witch talk and all of these things and witch house and all of that. But I think it was because of that. It's because I had a chance to pitch a book, and that was what I went to. And now I'm forever this person. And I had a chance to, I could have done a pen, like a fake name, but I decided to do it under my real name because I felt if I believed it, I should be willing to stand by it. And also to burn my bridge. There's no way I can possibly go back to a normal life now. I spent the rest of my 20s trying. I was like, what have I done to myself? I went to try to work in advertising and corporate and all this stuff. It's like nothing worked until I went back to magick. So that's kind of why. But in terms of why I wanted to share it with people, well, I mean, I suppose it's like when you get into anything and it's like really exciting, you want to share it with people. Mm-hmm. So probably right away.
Tell me, what does it look like? I've never been to magick.me.
Okay. It's basically Netflix for learning magic. It's streaming video. So you go and it's courses with me and other teachers. We have Lon Milo Duquette, who's probably the best, he's, in my opinion, the best writer on tarot in the world. Nikki Pellerano teaches astrology, so we do have astrology. But it's kind of like you go and it's a streaming site. So you're watching courses, and we have courses on basically all these topics: hermeticism, chaos magic, astral projection, tarot, I Ching, all the super fun stuff. It's for anyone, and it should be for anyone. And one of the things that I've learned is that everyone is interested, because everyone wants, particularly now, to feel empowered. Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot of people don't feel any power whatsoever now, particularly after, during COVID, people felt very powerless, I think. And there's a lot of uncertainty. And so it's very reassuring in times of social turmoil and unrest to realize that there actually are stable kind of, I don't want to say laws, but there are stable structures to the universe where, like, for instance, if you are grateful, your life will be better, mm-hmm. right? So, but thank you. I'm trying to modernize it. I mean, I'm working on it. I try to incorporate as much modern technology as possible also. So now, for instance, there's brain sensing headbands, right? They can actually give you analytics on your meditation. There's like wearables, right? That we can
Read
have
your brainwaves.
Yeah, so it's like that's never been possible ever in history. I mean, they didn't have that in the caves in India and Tibet or something like that. That's awesome. Why wouldn't we take advantage of that? So I have students use that. We've tried to do like rituals, group rituals in virtual reality, and they worked. And instead of me guiding or forcing something, I just said, okay, well, let's see what emerges, what's going to happen. And this guy started doing this whole Hindu fire ritual. And it was very profound, and everyone felt, and this is again in virtual reality with little like Sims type cartoon figures, and you could feel the spiritual peace emanating off of it. And at the end of it, he said, I don't know where that came from. I work in IT, I'm Indian, but I work in IT, and I've never been interested in Hinduism ever. And this is like something my ancestors did. And it just came out in this like goofy, like virtual reality session. You know, we have all this modern technology that is literally magic. So for me, like the idea of combining modern technology with the internal technology of consciousness change, I think that is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Do you think there's a relationship between magic and technology?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like think about it. You go back, like I always say this to people. You go back and you look at these magic books, all these grimoires and stuff like that, and they're super cool and vibey and all of that. But you look at the quote unquote powers they're promising people, and it seems really fantastical. It's like, okay, well, you can teleport yourself. Well, like you emailed me and flew me from Austin to Malibu, you know, so that's pretty good. I mean, I literally woke up yesterday in Austin and now I'm here. So, you know, like the crystal ball speaking with people on the other side of the world. Well, you got Zoom, right? You know, it's like having things brought to you. You got Amazon delivery. Magic carpet, you got Uber. You know, it's like, so we already have magic powers, quote unquote. We already are as gods, as Stuberbrand said. It's like, we already have the power of gods. The question is, what do we do with it? And clearly, that's what people are struggling with right now. It's kind of like, you know, we're basically trying to deal with the social consequences of social media. And now we're going to have to deal with AI. So now we're in a world where where there are gods. Okay, there's a god called ChatGPT that everybody's interacting with that appears more intelligent than humans, which is actually not, but experientially in a lived way it is, right? So we already live in a world of gods and monsters, and we live in a world in which there aren't really any ethical frameworks or constraints really for people. It's really easy to criticize people for being one way or the other, but then when you realize that people don't really have systems, like let's say that there's actually a system for becoming fully human, right? Developing yourself into a full rounded human being that you didn't have to pay to access, you know, would you have to go to school for it? You could get on the internet. That's the type of stuff that people need right now. It's not quote unquote power that people need, although they need to be reminded of the power they have over their own lives. It's, I think, structure on that so that they can access it. Yeah, and so that they can understand this world, because like nobody understands how to deal with AI. Just take that as an example.
Are you wary of AI?
I'm really excited about it, actually. I think we're going into an age where, you know, in the same way that sampling and, you know, like home recording and then things like, you know, let alone what people have now, like Logic and Ableton and things like that, like opened up, democratized access to music. It's like things like Midjourney and GPT. Like I've been going to conferences where people are talking about it's now possible for one person to make a feature film using AI in their bedroom. And it might take a year, but they can do it.
Takes more than a year without AI, with a big crew and millions of dollars.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, what is that going to unleash when the world's creativity is unleashed? I mean, it's like, you know, the whole Lou Reed thing about between a thought and expression is a lifetime. Well, now it's like one GPT or Midjourney prompt. You know, like I was sitting there, I use it. You know, I'm writing, I bounce ideas back and forth as a creative partner.
Tell me about that. I've never used it.
Oh, really?
Tell me what that's like.
It's like having a creative partner. It's like, hey, like, how do I solve this problem? What do you think about this? And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. But like when I'm writing, I'll also use that to essentially as a more efficient Google for research. And if I have
talk to it, or do you type?
I suppose I could, but mostly typing. So I'll be writing. If I'm writing, like I'll use Midjourney to generate images of the world I'm imagining, so I can be literally seeing it and going there. There'll be AI for literally everything, and so that's really frightening, obviously, for a lot of reasons, because everything is going to change. But I don't think that it's going to be the end of the world. And I've started calling it augmented intelligence instead of artificial intelligence. Because I think approaching it like that, like, do you remember the movie Aliens?
I never saw it.
Okay, so there's a part where the hero gets into this power loader kind of mech suit. I kind of see AI as that. It's like a robot suit to get into that extends your capabilities. It's allowed me to do things faster and finish projects faster than I ever could before. It's allowed me, the amount that I can do as essentially a solo entrepreneur has become vastly more, fairly cheaply. So I think that AI will it has the possibility to blow up the world's creativity and learning, because people will just be able to do things quicker.
When you say blow it up, mean making it bigger, not destroying it.
Maybe we should specify. Yeah. I find it's like if I'm working on something and there's like that last 5% or 10% where I'm trying to figure something out, but it feels physically painful to get to, like my brain's out of juice somehow. That's what AI is really good for, I think, solving those little things. It's not going to replace creativity. It's not going to replace coding even, but it's going to change our society in ways that nobody can predict.
Tell me some specific stories about John Dee.
Okay. I mean, you basically have the equivalent of an underpaid government consultant teaming up with a very, very, like the equivalent of an unstable telephone psychic, and hanging out in a dark room for 10 years, probably taking psychedelics, I would guess, because they were, that stuff grew wild in England, and doing rituals to contact angels. And the stuff that came out of those sessions is so bizarre. It's not what you would expect.
Are there records of all of it?
Oh, yeah. Like stacks of, hundreds and hundreds of pages they wrote down. Half of it was burned, unfortunately, but the part that wasn't, we still have.
Purposely or mistakenly?
Purposefully at one point, so that Catholic agents didn't get it when they were in Prague, so they wouldn't be killed. And I think at one point, they buried a bunch of them. It's similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls. They buried a bunch of the records in the backyard, and a servant found them after Dee was dead, didn't know what they were, and started burning them as firewood until somebody stopped this person. So a lot of it was destroyed. But the stuff that came out of there is so bizarre. I mean, let's say you think, oh, they're talking to angels, it's wings and things like that. I mean, no. At one point, they meet God, and God is a gigantic humpback whale covered with eyes. And it's like, I'll go with that. That sounds about right, actually. Things like that. I mean, they're seeing angels with, that are towering with legs that are pillars of brass. And, the angels really put them through the ringer. They initiated them into the system, and then they said, okay, now you have to literally go to Prague to tell the Holy Roman Emperor that he needs to institute a world religion with the angels at the head of it and employ you as the people in charge of instituting it. That didn't go over very well. But they were gallivanting across Europe trying to sell that idea. In the process, probably set the framework for what became Rosicrucianism, for what became Freemasonry, which is what became science. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that book is chock full of things like that. I think about that whale thing a lot. That book is chock full of the most bizarre psychedelics, and it's like it's psychedelic, not like Grateful Dead psychedelic, like you scraped some moss off a dungeon floor in medieval England and ate it, and you're still tripping after 7 days, that type of thing.
Tell me about Rosicrucianism.
Basically, the hippie movement of the 17th century. It's a fantastic example of cultural engineering. It's a fantastic example of, an early example of people influencing the culture in a mass way. We're talking about early 1600s, Central Europe, Catholic Church is in control of everything. Pre-science. You can still get burned at the stake for saying practically anything. And whoever these people were, probably just, smart kids, circulated these things called the Rosicrucian manifestos throughout Europe.
Was it written?
Yeah. A little like, like Mao's Little Red Book or something like that. And the manifestos basically said there's a secret brotherhood of Illuminati initiates all throughout Europe that are working both in secret and in the spirit world to end the domination of the Catholic Church on Europe and to free humanity to follow its destiny. We're everywhere, we're watching, we're all around you. But there's only one way to contact us. Only one. We won't respond to anything else. And that's, you have to do something in public that gets everyone's attention, basically a PR stunt, in the name of free thinking that you then claim for the Rosicrucians. So then, of course, what happened is all over Europe, almost spontaneously, there were all these events where people were, I don't know exactly what, but they were doing, big public spectacles claiming a new age of reason and science.
Do we know any examples of what they were doing?
We probably do, but none are coming to mind right now. And so it basically self-created itself, as if it's like a rabbit out of a hat. It's so that was the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. So then, of course, all these people started talking to each other.
So there wasn't a leader?
No, it was probably based on ideas that John Dee had left on the continent when he was there. But it was just a completely grassroots thing, similar to like, I don't know, raves or something like that, where it just kind of happened. And then because all those people started talking, there were all these magical things about it. The idea was an invisible brotherhood of illuminated adepts. But when these people actually started talking in real life, they realized they had a lot of other interests in common too. And then now that they had a space to talk safely, that's where science came out of. The ideas that became modern science came out of this kind of just bootstrapped cultural prank. And there actually is a Rosicrucian order that claims to do Egyptian magic and all that, but probably doesn't have any connection to the original thing.
And is the Brotherhood in Blavatsky the same, referring to the same group?
That's the question. It's like, are these things actually real? Are they not? Are they talking about the same thing? Are there different groups? Anyone's guess, really. Anyone's guess.
The human foot is a true marvel of engineering. With 26 bones, 33 joints, and over 100 muscles and tendons, it's built for flexibility, balance, and natural movement. Unfortunately, today's narrow, rigid, elevated shoes undermine this natural brilliance and weaken your feet. Vivo barefoot shoes set your feet free. Feel every step. Move naturally. Allow your feet to function as nature intended with Vivo barefoot. Thin, flexible soles to keep you connected to the ground. Wide toe boxes to let your toes spread and stabilize. Minimalist shoes designed to mimic the barefoot experience. Whether you're running, hiking, or just going about your day, Vivo Barefoot has you covered precisely when and where you need it most. Feel the vibration of the earth. Strengthen your feet. Improve your posture. Enhance your natural movement with Vivo Barefoot. Made from 100% recycled and natural materials, they are as healthy for the planet as they are for you. Experience the freedom of barefoot movement with the protection from the sharp edges of a man-made world. Natural movement for your feet, sustainable choices for our world. Learn more at vivobarefoot.com/tetra and embrace your human nature.
Tell me about Blavatsky.
So, H.P. Blavatsky, she was a Russian psychic in Victorian England, and she started the Theosophical Society in 1875, which was kind of like almost a new Christian religion, but it was very New Agey. It was the beginning of the New Age. She claimed to have received a bunch of channeled writings from Tibetan ascended masters, and then created this essentially religion theosophy, which blended together, essentially merge all of the Western and Eastern techniques in one place philosophically, but without giving anyone any real practical techniques. But it was huge. It became, there's still all the old theosophical centers are here. There's Crotona up on the hill and all that, and then Ojai. It ended up becoming a force in world history because they built up a bunch of stuff in India. They wanted to turn this kid, Krishnamurti, into the world teacher, which he later refused to his credit. That's a famous story. Gandhi was somewhat inspired by him, just in the case that Gandhi was interested in theosophy and was taking theosophical classes, but then decided he was just interested in just Hinduism more, and then that started his path to what he became. So really important culturally, really important historically, not very interesting to me simply because they don't really give any practical techniques. And again, like for me, it's about the practical technique rather than the overload.
What's your general feeling on channeled material?
Depends on the channel material. Most of it, no. Some of it, real hard to disagree with. Ones that I would consider certainly worth looking at by intelligent people. Let me put it that way. I'm not going to say whether things are real or not, but ones that I think are interesting enough of cases for intelligent people to look at and come to their own conclusions about would be the John Dee material for sure. Let me put it this way. It's incontrovertible that they believed what they were doing, I think. It might have been code too, but the John Dee one, the Book of the Law, the Aleister Crowley one, and actually the Law of One, the raw material, I think is interesting.
The Law One, the raw material.
Yeah. I think that at the very least, it's very clear that humans can get into an extremely deep trance state where material can emerge that is beyond them, that appears to be some type of intelligence that they wouldn't have access to normally. Yeah, I think that actually Ed Kelly, John Dee's psychic, may have been in a situation where Dee was constantly pushing him to do drugs all the time to start channeling material. And I feel like that's kind of the thing it's another one of the things why magic is tricky. You know, another one of the reasons why it's a secret tradition is because it's really private. It's really private. It's like personal. And it's not like a trick you want to do on stage, although there are performers there's lots of actors who do it, who are clearly being possessed by the thing that they are portraying. And then people think they are that person, like Heath Ledger is an example. I wanted to ask you, I'm just like legitimately really curious about what you think about this. You know, in the ancient world, I mean, Plato, but prior to that, all the way back to Sumeria, it was considered that people had a genius. Like there was a spirit that was a genius outside them that if they could listen to, would tell them what they needed to know and would come through them. And then later on, of course, it became that people are geniuses. And basically what Crowley says is that the techniques of magic are useful for turning on genius, allowing people to tap that higher self, whatever that is. But he went back and forth on whether that was an external being or just a psychological abstraction, like my best self, my greatest life, my highest self, or my deeper self. And you've interacted with a lot of geniuses in altered states of consciousness, and I'm curious if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think all of the material comes from outside of us for sure, for everyone. The way that the pieces get put together can be more artful. And that's sort of where the individual genius is, in seeing the way the pieces go together.
Yeah, that's a quite a skill set though. You know, having the ability to be totally open, but then to have the craft to actually execute on it.
Absolutely.
Because the thing about magic is it's really easy with magic. It's really easy to get, you know, cosmic enlightenment, cosmic experiences, visions, all that. But if you don't have the tools to express it, it just kind of spins around in there. And that can be very frustrating.
Same is true in terms of work ethic. They're some of the most talented people in the world that you've never heard of because they don't have the work ethic to be able to share it in a way where you'd ever get to find out.
Okay.
I think the intellectual gets in the way of what we're talking about.
So a lot of why magic is looks so complex, and there's like all these super like computer diagrams, and you open these books and they look like electrical engineering books, is because that's what guys like me like IT guys, you know, like engineering guys. There's as many paths to whatever we want to talk about, let's just for lack of a better word, God, okay? There's as many paths to God as there are types of people.
Yes.
That's why there's so many spiritual paths, I think. That's really easy to get sectarian about or hung up about, like, oh, well, like if all these different things are out there, then clearly none of them are right, but it's because there's different types of people. Some people are going to get connected to God by taking ecstasy and dancing in a field. okay, like really, really heavily. Some people are going to do it in a library, but there's got to be something for everyone. And one of the things about Western magic and why it's so complex is it's meant to overload the intellect to the point where it gets out of the way.
Right.
You just like blast it with all this stuff till it's just like, I can't do it anymore. And then that can allow a moment of egress of something else to come through.
What you said before about Freud was interesting. Do you think by calling it magic, labeling it magic, it somehow diminishes it in our society?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. And this is something that I've, struggled with throughout my career. I inherited it because it's the name of the tradition. And I could have been anything. I could have been a lawyer or a doctor. I would have been so successful, but here I am pushing this boulder up the hill. So yeah, it is. And it's silly and it's goofy. And, in the early part of my career, when I first kind of took this on, everyone told me, including everyone into this subject, find a different word for it. Like, I couldn't do it. Because it's like, what do you call it? It's like consciousness studies, like reality engineering. I mean, neurolinguistic programming was cool, but that's its own thing. None of that sounds cool. I mean, even saying it's like, yes, it's embarrassing, but it's also like, which one are you going to want to read about? Mindfulness or magic? It's like, I want to be able to throw fireballs out of my hands. Like that's my goal here. Like, come on, let's be realistic here. Like, I can be all serious and stuff, but like, it sounds cool. So there's an aspect to it where it is P.T. Barnum a little bit. And I like that. I've decided I kind of embrace that because people are interested in it. And I was really embarrassed by it for a long time. And I just thought I'd ruined my life and I just made myself a laughingstock. And then I realized I have, but that's kind of cool still. And I think that there's something about magic that, particularly because it's such a path of the self and of the, exaltation of the self, there's something about calling it magic that kind of keeps you a little humble because it's goofy. You know what? No adult in 2024 can walk around and call themselves a magician and with a straight face. So I don't keep a straight face. So,
Is it exaltation of the self or is it self-development?
I mean, they're the same thing, right?
I don't know.
The raising of the self on a vertical line, but then ultimately the surrender of the self, but not right away, only when it's worth surrendering.
How much belief is involved in magic?
I mean, I feel like in many ways, I feel like the best way to present it is just from an atheistic perspective. You don't have to have any belief. In fact, in many ways, when you engage in magic, it disproves a lot of supernatural stuff. Like, okay, if you do a lot of yoga, as you do a lot of meditation or pranayama, you'll have mystical experiences. Okay, well now now it's like when you go back and you read the book of Deuteronomy or something like that, it's like you go back and you read these sacred texts about these sacred people who had visions. It's like, well, you just be like, well, I know how they did that. It's like, I know how that trick works. So all of a sudden now they don't seem like there's some higher person who's above you. They seem like something attainable. And I think magic is way more interesting if you come at it from a non-supernatural, from a totally scientific perspective. Because here's an example. It's quite likely that religious experiences are produced to some extent by activity in the temporal lobe. Okay, because they've examined, I don't know what the current science is on this. So they said, well, we've disproven, that's just part of the brain. We've disproven that. That's a physical phenomenon. And then the religious people are all like, no, we can't do that because all of our financials are dependent upon fairy tales. But the interesting thing there is, okay, well, if it's part of the brain, then it can be activated. And if it can be activated with yoga, let's do that. And maybe refine it so we can do it really quickly. And so wouldn't we be in a better society if people could access even just meditation, Essentially what meditation is toilet training. It's like emotional toilet training, right? And we live on a planet of people who are not toilet trained. And so as a result, they're shitty to each other. They shit up the place. They get shit on the walls. They do all kinds of shit they shouldn't do. But then what do? They go to the great guru, the man who sits on the throne, who knows how to use the toilet, which is meditation. If you just let your body relax long enough, it will process your emotional garbage on its own. And so if we had a planet where people learn some basic spiritual techniques, not as some highfalutin, like all this crap that gets put on it, but just to be able to release their own negative emotions.
Get out of our own way.
Yeah. Instead of going on social media and taking it out on other people. I mean, that sounds pretty good to me. So I actually think magic is a lot more interesting. You know, there's just like a carnival barker aspect. I still use the word, A, because I do believe in magic, but B, because it gets attention. And C, it's not a lie. It isn't the actual tradition, is the occult tradition. There actually is magic that works just like the magic in the movies once you get far enough in.
What was your first introduction to meditation?
Through magic. Because every magic book you get, the first thing they all say is, none of this is going to work if you can't silence your mind and focus on one thing at a time. So the most important skill in magic is single-pointed focus and being able to direct your mind. And so it's like with meditation, you get the ability to have like laser single-pointed focus. That in alone is a faculty that people are losing, you know. But then magic comes in and says, okay, now that you can have single-pointed focus, here's some things you might want to focus on that would do some interesting things.
Welcome to the House of Macadamias. Macadamias are a delicious superfood, sustainably sourced directly from farmers. Macadamias, a rare source of omega-7, linked to collagen regeneration, enhanced weight management, and better fat metabolism. Macadamias, heart healthy and brain boosting fats. Macadamias, paleo-friendly, keto and plant-based. Macadamias, no wheat, no dairy, no gluten, no GMOs, no preservatives, no palm oil, no added sugar. House of Macadamias, dry roasted with Namibian sea salt, cracked black pepper, and chocolate dipped. Snack bars come in chocolate, coconut white chocolate, and blueberry white chocolate. Visit houseofmacadamias.com/tetra.
What type of meditation practice did you do?
When I first started, it was just focusing on objects or single-pointed focus.
Visual.
Both, and imagined, or mantras. You know, as it tends to be how it gets done in Western magic.
In Western magic, are the mantras specific?
Yes, but the other thing about magic is you make your own mantras. That's the thing. You go to like the Eastern traditions, and it's like they charge you for mantras and things like that. Well, you know, chaos magic realized, you know, what is a mantra? Okay, the Hindu mantras have been used for thousands of years, so there's like a certain ongoing resonance behind it. But past that, a mantra is a way to suggest something to your unconscious that your conscious doesn't know about. So in magic, we have sigils, which is you take a statement, you take a desire that you want to happen, and then you scramble it into a mantra that you then repeat so that you're putting all of your energy into it, but your conscious mind doesn't know what it is. So a little bit of theory about this. The way that magic is different from self-help, or actually religion in many ways, is that it engages the unconscious instead of just the conscious mind. Because we all know that when we try to get something with our conscious mind, we have to deal with our conscious mind, and the conscious mind is always finding reasons why, picking it apart, saying, you know, who are you to do something like that, all of that type of stuff. So when you're trying to get something done in your life, it could be creative or not, you have to manage that, right? So all those things are like, if you think of an electrical current, it's like disrupting and breaking the current of energy going to your goal.
It's like a hack.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is. So this is a hack to just root underneath that doubting voice. And this is the same way, in a sense, that religions work. But when you go to a church, they're using all these symbols like the cross or whatever it is. They are choosing what to impress your unconscious mind with. And often there's a sense of basically just we're bigger than you, right? Obviously, corporations or the same logos are constantly programming us. We're constantly, all you have to do is walk outside, and you're going to be programmed by, endless electronic information. So here you're taking control of it for yourself. Another way to look at that is if you think about language, if you only know one language, as I do, despite the Duolingo owl's best attempts, then you're kind of limited by that symbol set. Like you've only got that potential range of notes to play, right? Okay. Well, that's probably not the full capacity of your brain. How do you even access a concept? We know as humans that as soon as we can name something, we can begin to work with it and exercise will over it. But how do we access things that we can't name or we don't understand? Maybe because they're capacities of the human mind that we haven't figured out yet, or capacities of the human being that people won't understand for another several thousand years. Well, they're still there. So how do we access what is beyond our sense of self, the linguistic self? How do we go into the parts of our brain that are non-linguistic? I mean, you can see how that could be useful. Yeah.
What do we know about the history of witchcraft?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mentioned the thing about the IT guy and intellectual stuff. Magic, obviously, right now is huge with women. Young women, they're very interested in the idea of witchcraft, of the female empowerment, which is great.
Do we know what sparked that?
Yeah, I mean, feminism, needing empowerment. Not needing. I don't think it's needing. It's expressing, because everyone is expressing the will to power, right? Everyone has to express the will to power, but men and women do it differently. And in terms of specifics, I couldn't tell you. In a lot of ways, it's really hard to talk about witchcraft as a tradition, largely because women are a lot less interested in codifying, regimenting, and writing things down than men are. And there's probably a lot of stuff about quote unquote women's mysteries that they just don't want written down for men to read, I would imagine. But I have the privilege now of working with thousands of people, teaching thousands of people this stuff. So I get to see the patterns in the people that are interested in this. And I think that for men, magic is very much about becoming. I have to become something. I have to become a hero, a legend. And that's like every single movie. I have to become the king.
Hero's journey.
The hero's journey. Absolutely. Whereas for women, it's much more about embodying. I already am. I am the goddess, And magic in general tends to help men think much more femininely and women think more masculinely for whatever reason, because it balances you in the process of making a more complete person. So witchcraft, I think I would describe it to kind of like the spontaneously emergent magical properties of women as they are, which are endlessly holy and wonderful and mysterious. So it's hard to define, But I think that there's a tremendous amount of interest in it in culture now because women for so long have felt disempowered. And this is a system, this is something that promises them empowerment. And it's empowerment in a way that is witchcraft as magic as a whole. Magic as a whole is much more a path of letting things happen by allowing space for them to happen rather than, I guess, a more masculine approach to doing things.
More like the Tao.
Yeah, well, that would be the ideal, right? I mean, I'm trying to get there, I hope. But, I think there's a lot of interest in the goddess Babylon, for instance, who's considered the kind of the Thelemic goddess of magic. That's a resurgent archetype with young women. I think that everyone is interested in magic now. Everyone in the world has the same needs, rich, poor, healthy or sick, it doesn't matter. They need meaning, they need a connection to God. I think the need for meaning.
People are starved for some connection, something greater than themselves.
Do you feel now more than 30 years ago, for instance?
Yes.
Well, it's kind of the thing too. It's like, in the past, magic was always caught up with the counterculture identity.
It seems like a countercultural thing. I think of it as, maybe that's why I'm attracted to it, is I'm interested in the counterculture.
Yeah, absolutely, right? It is a counterculture thing. But the thing that has come along with a lot of those counterculture scripts is like that kind of like, F the mainstream, destabilize reality, all of that stuff. I just don't think any of that is relevant anymore. It's like, look around, like things are pretty destabilized. I think now what people need is structure and definitely meaning. Our culture went through really, like we rejected religion. We got to a large degree. I mean, if people are religious now, they're religious as another option in like the consumer shopping mall of identities you can buy something from. They're not religious because they have to be, or there's a threat of violence here at least. So we went through that, and that's good. We got science. We shouldn't go back to religion, as a lot of people are suggesting now. But it's like, we're too smart for religion now. It's not like it's bad that we are godless or whatever. That's actually good. We still have a need to connect to something bigger than us. We still need a sense of meaning. We need a sense of humility. We need, the biggest role that religion's played, I think, is a sense of community and connection with other people that's not based on transaction. Podcasts do that in a lot of ways now. They fulfill some of that. So I propose magic as something that is not scientific, but is empirical and is self-directed and is a way to be structured and disciplined about your spiritual quest as a human being, which is different for not only different for everybody, but different for each person at different times in their life. So there's no one size fits all, because everyone's in a different situation. Everyone's basically the same, but we're all in different moments. So for me, the idea of something that is, okay, so I can still be spiritual, I can still have meaning, I can still tap into wisdom and something that's more than just the latest Apple product, which I also want to buy, but is more than just that. But that doesn't involve somebody telling me what to do.
Have you been surprised by anything that's come up in your practice?
The entire thing. I mean, like, what specific, like all of it. People get really hung up about like practice and skill and learning magical techniques and all that. I just feel that if you're fun to play with, the universe will enjoy playing with you.
That's a good attitude. That sounds good. That's helpful. What do we know about the first temple?
Oh, the first temple. Okay, well, this is rather topical these days. The story of the temple is fascinating to me, and in a lot of ways, the Western esoteric tradition is a story about the temple. Judaism is a story about the temple. Christianity is a story about the temple. Hermeticism, at least the Masonic parts, what's going on the news right now is a story about the temple.
And the temple is not a physical space, is that correct?
I think that, as far as the evangelicals are concerned, oh no, they're building that temple. That's happening for real. The way that I've heard other people express it, for instance, the Orthodox, if you go to the Orthodox church here, beautiful spot, St. Sophia, priest there said, I think the Catholics believe this too, as far as the Christian church is concerned, the third temple is the body of Christianity. It's the Christian church, meaning all of the believers in Christ are collectively make up the invisible third temple. What is it? I don't know. Clearly, that's not the interpretation that is in play in the real estate over in the Middle East right now. Just amazing how the fight over that particular piece of real estate has been the axis on which, like, thousands of years of history have turned. The Crusades. It's nuts, right?
Might it have some otherworldly power?
Of course, right? Do you know about Jerusalem syndrome?
No.
So apparently, I've never been to Israel, but apparently it's a very, very common experience for people who go there, particularly, I guess, Christians who go there to suddenly decide that they're Jesus, to the point that they have a whole wing of one of the central hospitals dedicated to people who think they're Jesus.
It's interesting.
So it's got to have a heavy, I mean, how can it not? I mean, it's like just the amount of stuff that's happened there. And that goes back to the dawn of civilization. Like
And the first
Sumeria,
temple
all
also
that.
appears in all the esoteric teachings as well.
Yeah. Well, the temple in a way is also the metaphor for somebody's life, in the sense that, in your life, you're building a temple and then it gets knocked down and you build it up again and it gets knocked down again. And that sucks, particularly the first time. But it's not like it stops sucking or it could get worse, So the temple is kind of similar to a Western way of talking about, like, similar to like a sand mandala or impermanence. But the idea is that it always gets built back better the next time. And that's a really important lesson for people to learn I think in their lives and in their careers. Like in my career, I've gone through so many stages where I thought I had it right and then I didn't, so it collapsed. But then I took the learning from that and built it right the second time. And then that kind of spirals onward as a process. I think that's a big part of, at least in my perspective, I mean, that seems to be one of the keys of, life. Certainly being, creative in any way, but it's certainly one of the keys of life is like, you have to know when to surrender and when not to. Because there's times where you definitely don't want to, but there's times where like there's nothing you can do where the universe will let you do it because it doesn't want you to do that. Like, when I left LA in 2020, I spent like a year trying to find places to live, and every place I tried to move ended up falling apart. Like we were going to move to West Hills. Did you know that West Hills is the location of one of the biggest nuclear disasters in U.S. history?
I did not know that.
They don't want anyone to know. It was actually covered up in the 50s. There was an exposed nuclear core at a nuclear reactor up there, and they vented it over the valley. It's right next to Spawn Ranch, actually. So people have been drinking cancer water ever since in Thousand Oaks, and it's been kept quiet. And where I was going to move was like exactly where the runoff
How did you
hit.
find out?
Wikipedia
No.
the night before.
So it might have been true. Maybe that's true.
Oh, no, it's definitely true because then I did the research. It's definitely, but then I ended up moving to Austin, which is also really, really, really emotionally hard, but now it's awesome. So it sucks when you're going through it, but I feel like sometimes you just got to know when to roll over because the universe will, I think at times force you in certain directions.
What may fall within the sphere of tetragrammaton? Counterculture? Tetragrammaton. Sacred geometry? Tetragrammaton. The avant-garde? Tetragrammaton. Generative art? Tetragrammaton. The tarot? Tetragrammaton. Out-of-print music? Tetragrammaton. Biodynamics? Tetragrammaton. Graphic design? Tetragrammaton. Mythology and magic? Tetragrammaton. Obscure film? Tetragrammaton. Beach culture? Tetragrammaton. Esoteric lectures, tetragrammaton. Off-the-grid living, tetragrammaton. Alt spirituality, tetragrammaton. The canon of fine objects, tetragrammaton. Muscle cars, tetragrammaton. Ancient wisdom for a new age. Upon entering, experience the artwork of the day. Take a breath and see where you are drawn.
Tell me about the audience for your work.
Mostly male. I would like to change that, of course. But, it's like just one of those things where people will be attracted to someone who's like them. So since I'm a nerdy male, I get lots of nerdy guys, which is great. They're my people. And, it's all across the board. Because one of the things is, in order to learn magic, you had to go find some secret society to join. And not everyone is going to be involved in that type of thing. It's a bit much. So the internet allows more people to access it that wouldn't have normally. I think in this culture, people have a crisis of meaning, but they also have a crisis of role and identity. Classic examples like the mid-career change. Like, for instance, I worked in finance, but now I want to transition into being a yoga teacher or something like that. You hear this type of thing a lot. I do at least. And I think that there are some real meaning crises, particularly for men. For men, there are two big meaning crises that I tend to meet people during. One of them is the young men when they get out of college. What do I want to be? All of a sudden, you thought life was going to be an adventure. You thought you were going to be the hero in the movie. Take a number, buddy. Life's not an adventure, and you're not clear about who you want to be. I tend to work with a lot of people who are in that moment. Then there's another crisis of meaning later in life, which is the midlife crisis, which is I got the job, I played it safe, I'm successful, I have, kids, responsibilities, employees. But not only now do I not have any time to myself, but I feel like I'm not who, I'm not who I was supposed to be. I'm not who I meant to set out to be. Yeah, that was a tough one for me because I mentioned in my early career, everything was really easy for me and I had all this early success. But then, even though I told myself I wasn't doing it, I started to be like, yeah, like
Ego.
like,
Yeah.
and it started to show. And I started to have like falling outs with people that had helped me.
Yeah. It's common.
I mean, I still feel guilty about that every day. And I'm 42 years old now.
Right.
We're talking about things that happened when I was 23. And then, of course, nothing worked for me. Of course, because now my ego's involved. And also now people are expecting me to be a certain person. I mean, I basically went from being an extremely awkward English student to having a book contract at 21 for a book saying that there's going to be a new counterculture of occult people. I mean, that's a pretty insane place to be.
Yeah.
Of course, then the next thing people did was tear me down on the internet. But what was actually happening is probably what I assume happens with a lot of musicians when they come out of local scenes, which is the people that you thought you were in a scene with, that you thought were going to come along with you. Oh no, they're not coming along with you. They're going to try and tear you down for leaving them behind back here. And I think that I assume that happens with musicians a lot. But so then my ego was back involved and I had a horrible time of it. And, I tried to run away from what I'd done.
Yeah.
Completely.
Was the first book successful?
By occult book terms, it was in that world now.
That's cool.
Thank you. But then I tried to go back into the corporate world and completely erase that I'd ever been this person. And it didn't work and I was miserable. And I finally realized in my early 30s, I was like, okay, asshole, like speaking to myself, like you're going to go around all over the world learning all this magic stuff. You're going to learn all these techniques for radically changing people's minds and lives and perceptions. It could change literally anyone's life that encounters this material. And you're just going to keep it to yourself and mope about how people were mean to you on the internet? Like, really? So the thing that changed everything for me was like, no, it's not about you. And with magic, it's easy to make this mistake, like my level of whatever. It's about what services you can provide to other people. That's when I became a teacher, and then everything was great. And I had a privilege to work with all these people, including people who are in some really serious, hard situations who've been able to make real changes.
That's great.
One thing I wanted to mention before I forget, though, because I was looking at this, I work with a ton of musicians because they all understand. Well, all artists understand magic, like all of them. It's just, you call it something different. You talk about creative process, but like that whole thing of getting into that trance state where something comes through and you're like, where did that come from? I have no idea, right? So people, I think, understand, particularly in the entertainment industry, I feel like everyone's got some spiritual thing that they're doing. They're doing chanting or The Secret or whatever it happens to be. And so you'll definitely get people saying, well, why would I be interested in magic when I can just, for instance, do meditating? It's so much more pure. It's just straight to the source, right? Which it is. It is more pure. It is more straight to the source. With magic, you're basically opening up the mixing board. And this is a metaphor I use when I'm talking to musicians all the time, where it's like, okay, well, now you've got fire. It's like, okay, well, like turn down the fire knob and maybe turn up the water knob a little bit so it balances out. And then you've got your Saturn knob. Maybe I'm feeling a little bit too depressed, so let's turn down the Saturn knob and let's turn up the solar knob. Okay, well, now I'm feeling like I can do anything. All right, well, let's turn up the communication knob, the Mercury knob. Okay, well, now I feel like I can write computer code. I'm totally plugged into information and learning. All right, let's turn that down. Okay, now I can watch TV again.
How do you turn them up and down?
Rituals. That's the whole thing of what Western magic is. That's kind of what they're for in a way,
Tell me about archetypes.
So let's take a common magic thing. Let's say, summon a god, right? Okay, what does this actually mean? Well, if I summon Venus, then, maybe I'll imagine myself as Venus. Or if I summon Mercury or something like that, Hermes, the side of my personality, the part of my brain that is concerned with calculation, math, numbers, writing, communication will completely possess me meaning that only that part of me will be inflamed, like accessed. It's like I pulled up that part of my software I'm running specifically so that I can just use that part of myself, or I can only address that to fix it if there's something wrong with it. You know, maybe I want to be better at math. Okay, well, I invoke the god Hermes. Okay, well, then I slowly imagine myself turning into the god Hermes, just like an actor would inhabit a role, till suddenly my consciousness identifies with Hermes. There's all kinds of procedures for doing this. And then as Hermes, I would realize maybe I would suddenly have an insight into when a teacher told me I wasn't good. This is just an example. A teacher told me I wasn't good at math in second grade, and I internalized that. And then I can go back and, by magic, heal that retroactively. Well, I mean, okay, so you could say you're doing psychological work, you're doing art therapy. Magic sounds cooler, you know, it definitely gets more people interested in it.
We know that Mercury relates to math, but do we know why? I know we can memorize the list of what relates to what, but where did that list come from? How was that list decided?
The specific reason is that it was done in the Golden Dawn. And at least the list that is used of attributions commonly was put together by MacGregor Mathers, who was the head of the Golden Dawn, who spent, I think possibly, this is actually similar to Karl Marx's story, oddly enough, spent like 10 years in the British Library piecing together all of the occult knowledge that was then known.
And when was this?
Late 1900s, which is a really trippy time to think about, because not only was it this massive explosion of culture, but it was like the 1990s, where like what would now be goth and industrial was people were super into the supernatural, goth art, Aubrey Beardsley, decadent art, that type of thing. But also they had just discovered ancient Egypt for the first time, and they just discovered ancient Sumeria for this first time, which no one knew Sumeria even existed. So you think about this time of cultural explosion, where not only are they coming up with new, and science is happening, all these new advances, but they're rediscovering a past that they didn't know existed before. And it was this incredible time in world history. But the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn put them together from earlier attributions by Agrippa. The answer ultimately is it's arbitrary. But
is it arbitrary?
The specific ones are arbitrary, but what is not arbitrary is the thought process that produced them, which is best expressed by Morrissey when he said, "Nature is a language, can't you read?" There's a Smith song. Where it's basically, where this stuff came from is, you know, looking at nature as a language and saying each thing that nature produces is a symbol, but it's also like a letter in an alphabet. And you can see that there's certain resonances between things, meaning this is just how artists think. Right. So the Hermetic way of looking at the world is the artistic way of looking for, you know, it's how does a sunflower make me feel, and how is this like the sun, and how can I relate those two things?
It's like poetic connection.
Yes. Yes. That's a much better way to put it. There are patterns that have just emerged cross-culturally that are just very clear. There's always a communication god. There's always a love goddess. There's always the king god. You know, it's just, human beings themselves are not that different. Our code deep down is pretty simple. It produces almost infinite outer forms. Like, it's insane, but our code is pretty much the same, I think.
Tell me about the tarot.
The tarot is the best book that Western culture produced ever. It's an interactive, shuffleable book that contains the entirety of the world's initiatory secrets, allegedly. So the story goes. The tarot is a deck of 78 cards that represent its 4 suits and 22 trumps. And again, in the 19th century, an occultist named Eliphas Levi figured out that you could map the tarot to the Kabbalistic tree of life. Essentially, the origin of the Western esoteric tradition historically is when Sephardic Jews brought Kabbalah into Spain after fleeing North Africa.
Is that where the tarot's from Spain?
The Kabbalah is from Spain.
Oh.
Tarot came from, I think, possibly India or possibly Egypt, but it was, I think, brought into Europe by Romani people. So those two things ended up combining, along with kind of the general folk magic and witchcraft that was around Europe at the time. Probably where the correspondences were originally put together was in the Medici city-states during the Renaissance, which is kind of in that John Dee period. What had happened, there was this moment in history where Constantinople was destroyed. So all of the Orthodox priests fled and went west to try and get protected by Western Christianity, by the Vatican. They brought with them all of these scrolls of Plato and Aristotle that the Western world did not have access to ever. So
that's interesting.
That's what sparked the Renaissance. So finally we were like, wait, there's stuff other than the Bible? Yeah. And it's like really good stuff. It sounds like, when you read about it, it sounds like San Francisco, it sounds like the tech industry now. It's like this incredible concentration of wealth in this small area run by these barons. And they want to know, it's kind of like how the tech industry now is this kind of ultra Luciferian. They want to know everything. They want to extend aging. It's like, it's cool. It's like, let's see what comes out of it. But it was kind of like that same, we want to control, know, and own everything. And so a lot of Hermeticism comes out of that period. It was Hermeticism all the way up until the scientific revolution was basically the religion for the European cognoscenti as opposed to Christianity.
Why do you think people are afraid of magic?
Because they've grown up watching too many horror movies. It's like, did you see Hereditary?
No.
Don't see it. Yeah,
I won't.
Like, horror movies now. I wanted to be a horror writer when I was a kid. Now I won't even watch them. I'm too much of a softie. So, but the answer is the Catholic Church.
Tell me about Manly P. Hall.
Big dude for LA. He was giving talks in LA for decades, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he was teaching the Western tradition. He was not teaching practical magic, and really left a great legacy. Although, I saw, I talked to his biographer, who talked about, it's kind of a sad story. At the end of Manly Hall's life, which is really sad for somebody who is so erudite like this, he kind of got taken in by alternative medicine, which led to his early demise. And he was way too willing. It's kind of happened with Steve Jobs too. He was way too willing to believe in kind of fraudulent health cures, which led not just led to him not getting cured of disease, but led to him dying in a hotel room, unfortunately.
Enneagram,
Gurdjieff. Yeah. Armenian mystic, Georgian Armenian. Yeah, and he's such a weirdo because he's so hard. He can't categorize him. He just made up his own bizarre science fiction language to teach in, which is really interesting. But his basic proposition that human beings are essentially asleep is where I start from. That's where everything starts from, in my opinion. It's like Gurdjieff said, you're out here asking for compassion and peace and respect on a planet of sleeping people. It's like, they're not evil, they're just asleep. And I think what he meant by that is the same thing that Buddhism says, which is that people are slaves to their reactivity. You learn that in relationships.
That's what Scientology says.
I know, right? But see, that's the thing. He got it right on that. I used to live right next to Scientology for 4 years. Bizarre, just terrifying. But I think he got it right, and then he went crazy when his ego got in the way. But I think that basic thing, I think he was right about that.
What do you think the difference between the ego and the will are?
Oh, that's easy. I mean, it's like, the ego is the thing yapping in your brain, and will is what happens when you get it out of the way.
So will is like the focused self.
It's like, I don't think so. It's like those statues of Shiva where you have the corpse at the bottom and Shiva standing on him and he's above him. And it's kind of I think it's the small s self has been defeated to let the God within out.
The will is outside of us. Is that what you're saying?
It feels that way experientially. Is it actually? Well, this is a question for neuroscience. It's experientially, it feels like it is. So it's kind of like that moment where you can get quiet enough where you can meditate for an hour and then just know something. Like you just know. And you weren't clear on it before, and it's not like you actively thought through it. It's like all of a sudden just
you access something.
Yeah, and it's almost like it's not just that you know it, it's like now the energy of your life is already moving in that direction, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah. What's your take on the wisdom of ancient culture versus how we see things today?
We need them both.
Or are we evolving or devolving?
Oh, but depends on who you're talking to and depends on the day. I've definitely got my devolving days. I think people are the same. And I think that modern technology is awesome. Science is awesome. Democracy is awesome. These things have given us incredible wealth, longer lifespans. We're not walking around with tooth pain all day long. That's a plus, you know. And despite, you know, all my early punk rock attitudes, the world has generally improved while I've been alive, and it's better than I thought it was going to be. And I realized I don't have anything to complain about with it anymore. But what magic does is it lets you access that other thing.
What do you believe today that you didn't believe when you were younger?
I can make mistakes.
That you're capable of making mistakes, or that you can make mistakes and it's okay?
I'd like to get to the second one. That I can make mistakes even when I think I'm doing my best.
I see.
That
you are actually human.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, one of the narratives that you can get when you first get into magic is this has been kept from you. And there's some conspiracy keeping this from you. And that we have to free everyone, we have to get it. And that's total nonsense. The reality is it's all there. It's just that people are too lazy to do the work, you know?
Also might not know about it.
Right. And then when they read it, they, you know, the people writing about it haven't done themselves any favors in terms of communicating it clearly. So, you know, it was very easy for me to be like, F the system and, you know, try to be, you know, all Marilyn Manson about things.
Were you a Marilyn Manson fan?
No, because not right away, because I was a snooty Joy Division fan who was like, why are these kids into Marilyn Manson now? This is my culture. So in terms of what's changed about me, it's just like I don't have anger really, and it's not because I'm like some ascended master of like wisdom. It's because like I've watched myself make mistakes enough to realize that, you know, it's not something out there, you know, affecting me. Yeah. And also that other people make mistakes too, and that's not because they're bad people. Mm-hmm. It's just because this is hard.
What do we know about animism?
It's really simple. I mean, animism is as simple as when you're a kid, when you look at the electrical socket and you think it's a face. The mind will project identity onto inanimate things. That's all it is. And then you talk to it as if it's alive. It's like when I was in Kathmandu, you know, I was talking to people and they would say like, yeah, that tree stump, that's God. You know, that bird, that's God. And it's interesting because we're taught that this is the most primitive form of thinking, but it's clearly what everyone I think is more animistic than anything else ever. You hear that when people say things like the universe is talking to me. I got a download from the universe. Like we're all connected. Everything's alive. That's animism, right? But it's animism from a broader perspective, from a perspective that's been through science already.
When you were told the tree stump was God, did you think that's not right?
No. What my reaction was that I thought it was hilarious because one of the things that, you know, back home in chaos magic, all the punk rock chaos magic people thought they were really clever because they had learned how to like, you know, a popular thing in chaos magic is trying to summon pop culture deities as gods. And then I realized it's like, well, this is what everyone does normally in the rest of the world. They sacralize everything. And there's something really beautiful about that. That's something people could learn from here. Make everything a ritual, like sacralize everything. It doesn't need to be this, like all this stuff, all this grimoire stuff, that's just old. That's his history. That's the Museum of Magic. That's old stuff. It's the thought process that counts. And just sacrally, just making a dinner sacred with other people, that's a profound thing. You know, just setting an intent for a meal. It doesn't need to be more complex than that. Mm-hmm. You know?
Do you pray?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I would call it more akin to whining and begging, but yeah.
What is gematria?
So gematria is in the study of the Torah. Every Hebrew character is considered to have a numerical value, and that therefore words.
Does it have a numerical value because of the number it is in the alphabet, or
No.
it has some other?
It's a different scheme.
Okay.
Yeah, it goes to base 10, and then it starts counting by tens, and then it starts counting by hundreds.
So the difference, the value difference between two letters can be many times based on what you're saying.
And it also depends on what position they are in the word can change the value. And, you know, when I'll explain any spiritual idea, it doesn't necessarily mean I ascribe to a religion or a belief, but it also doesn't mean that I don't subscribe to it.
Yeah.
Right? So
It just is what it is.
right. So you could have like a word, like if you have a word with like 5 letters, you could add up all the letters and they will have so now the word will have a value. And the idea there is that words that have the same value are in resonance with each other. So like if this is not a real one, okay, but like let's just say like the word for abyss is the same as the word for crowd. The idea is, okay, God is making a poetic juxtaposition of those things under the surface for those who want to look. It's kind of like an inner structure.
And how are the numbers treated differently depending on where they are in the word?
But there are a few letters, I think 4 or so letters that change their value if they're the last letter.
I see.
Why, I don't know. And this is a tricky practice, but it can be used to, let's say, once you know what all those letters and numbers mean, now all of a sudden you're going to start seeing them in license plates or on billboards. And then it's like, oh, like that's a message. Now that's tricky because that verges on mentally unhealthy ways of thinking. But, you know, magic.
Have you ever experienced it in that way? Have you gotten comfortable enough with it where you could just be out in the world and read those numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. But you have to turn it off after a certain point just to function. Yeah. So I try to keep most of the stuff just turned off.
Tell me about higher planes.
Higher planes of existence. I don't think there are higher. I think everything's here.
Okay.
I think that, you know, magic, and this is because of the word itself, people have a Hollywood idea about magic, like it's going to be something more. And I think that one of the reasons why it's been tricky for people in this culture is because it's more subtle. Magic is basically a language for noticing subtle things about your experience that other people don't pick up on because they're thinking about their shopping list or they don't have a language for it. It's like if you have 68 words for snow, you're going to have a better way to talk about snow. Same with magical language. It's a language for talking about things that you're already experiencing, that are already here.
Now that you have the language, you can notice it more clearly.
And you can talk with other people about it and get on the same page with somebody.
It's cool.
Yeah. So in terms of higher planes, there's definitely tons of different states of consciousness. And there's definitely visions and astral projection and all of that stuff. Ultimately, I have to come to a kind of a reductionist opinion that it must all be things that the brain is doing. And I can't say if any of that stuff is supernaturally real or not. But I can say for sure, for a demonstrable fact, that your brain will produce all kinds of crazy visions and fascinating stuff and synchronicities if you do certain practices. What does it mean? I don't know, but I know how to turn it on.
Is there a community aspect to magic.me, or is the flow of information only out?
There's definitely community, and there's community forums. I want to build that more.
Tell me how you think it would work.
Well, I've had a couple interesting experiments in that regard. One of them was doing ritual in virtual reality that I mentioned. And another one was, I just did an experiment once where I just turned on Zoom. This was during the pandemic. And I just left Zoom on as an open chat room for like 3 days and had students from all over the world just come in and out and talk to each other. And I was just kind of hands off. And a lot of really interesting things kind of spontaneously emerged from that. Like, there was a woman who was being human trafficked that emerged, and then I was able to work with her on that, and then she was able to get out of that situation. Wow. And these things just spontaneously kind of, and people were talking about magic and their experiences. And again, it's like people you would never expect. With magic, I think the question is, just like with spirituality, it's kind of like with everything. It's just, I think that people should be just honest and upfront about it and not turn it into something that it's not, and just talk about their own experiences. Because everyone has an experience of something like this.
How do you use magic in your life?
I use magic to be not reactive in my relationship. The only thing that I've done since I was 16 is magic. Every relationship I've had, every job I've had, my current job, magic.me is everything is for magic. So when I'm not, just relaxing and goofing off and playing PlayStation, pretty much everything else has always been dedicated to it. So that's kind of a tricky one.
You use the techniques.
I do the
on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I think you have to. I think it's really easy to get out of practice and convince yourself that it's just you don't need it. You're just a natural, and you're just doing magic by the way you live your life. But it's just like with meditation, right? Like with meditation, you can crest over a wave and then kind of ride the state that you get into for 3 months or something, and then it starts to kind of taper off. It's kind of like that with magic. Well, it is literally like that because it is meditation.
What would you say for those who are skeptical of magic? What are they missing?
You're skeptical for a reason. It's good to be skeptical. A lot of magic is BS, is the first thing that I would say. And I would say that I am skeptical of it. And in my process of approaching it like a skeptic, I've been able to basically pan some really interesting gold nuggets out of that riverbed. I would say that this is an area of study that we should not be afraid to talk about and that we should study. But also, I do lots of YouTube's debunking stuff. We should also, another reason why we should talk about it is so that we can be clear on what's scammy, because there's a lot of scammy stuff.
What would be an example of scammy magic?
Psychic scams, tarot scams, people saying that you have a curse put on you and only they have to pay you to remove it. Bad information. Almost all of the information out there is bad. People propping themselves up as local cult leaders or whatever. None of that would be good.
What are some of the most interesting conversations you've had on the podcast?
I just had one with Anne-Marie Krippel, who wrote a book called Death Nesting. She's a death doula. And we talk about people at the end of their life. So me being me, I just cut my normal bullshit completely. And I was just like, okay, how do I be happy when I die? And her answer was really interesting, which is it was meditation, but in really loud and chaotic environments. Because that's what the death process is like. You have to stay focused and present, but it's not like meditation in a quiet environment. It's people are yelling, it's the hospital, there's all that. So I thought that was really valuable. But then I asked her, because this is me, I just had to, I was like, so out of all of you've worked with so many people, and she's a Buddhist practitioner. And I said, of all the people that you've worked with, including the spiritual ones, especially the spiritual ones, have you met any that were at peace with dying? And she said, no.
That's interesting. Maybe the ones who are at peace with dying don't have the doula.
I don't know. Maybe. I hope so. But that was sobering. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, when we talk about religion and spirituality, what are we talking about? We're talking about our fear of death and our fear of being forgotten and our fear of it meaning nothing and our fear of losing our loved ones and the void. And we can talk a big game and say, well, I embrace the void. Really? Let's see. So that one was really interesting because I think it's really important. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you believe. You're still going to have to face the same initiations as everyone else. Let's put it that way.